There's a moment, lasting no more than 5 seconds, that reveals more about a person's underlying character than months of ordinary conversation ever could, and almost nobody knows to watch for it because it's designed, whether consciously or not, to slip past unnoticed. It isn't a moment of confrontation. It isn't a moment where someone's under obvious pressure to perform well. It's something smaller, almost invisible if you're not specifically trained to catch it. And once you understand what you're actually looking for, you'll start noticing it everywhere, in people you already know, and in people you're only just beginning to. Let me be honest about something before we go further, because it matters for how you use everything we're about to explore. This isn't a clinical diagnostic tool, and 5 seconds of observation can't actually diagnose anyone with anything. Narcissistic personality traits exist on a wide spectrum, and only a licensed professional, working with someone directly over time, can offer an actual diagnosis. What we're describing instead is something considerably more practical for everyday life, a specific, observable moment that reliably reveals the difference between someone whose empathy is genuine and someone whose empathy is performed, a difference that matters enormously for how much of yourself you eventually decide to invest in getting to know them further. Let's talk about what this test actually is, because it's simpler than you might expect, and its simplicity is exactly what makes it so reliable. Watch what happens in the 5 seconds immediately after you share something genuinely difficult, not devastating, just genuinely difficult. A frustrating day, a minor disappointment, a small worry weighing on you. Not the response they give after they've had time to construct one. The immediate, unguarded reaction, the one that happens before conscious thought has a chance to shape it into something more socially appropriate. This 5-second window is worth understanding as genuinely revealing, precisely because it's too brief for most people to fully control or perform, and what surfaces during it tends to be considerably more honest than anything said afterward, once the initial reaction has had time to be smoothed into something more polished. Here's what you're actually watching for. And it's worth breaking this down into specific, observable components rather than leaving it as a vague impression. First, does their facial expression shift toward you? Genuine attention and concern registering visibly, even briefly, before anything gets said at all? Or does something else happen first? A flicker of impatience, a barely perceptible shift toward boredom or distraction, an expression that seems to be calculating something rather than simply absorbing what you've shared? This first wordless reaction happens faster than conscious performance can typically manage, which is exactly why it's worth paying such close attention to. Second, and this is worth understanding as equally important, what's the very first thing they say before any follow-up questions, before any considered response? Genuine empathy tends to produce an immediate, simple acknowledgement of your experience specifically, something that centers what you actually described. Something considerably less genuine tends to produce one of two alternative patterns worth learning to recognize directly. The first is immediate redirection toward themselves, a similar experience of their own, offered not to build connection, but to shift the conversation's center of gravity away from you and toward them, often within the very first sentence they speak. The second is a kind of hollow, generic acknowledgement, technically appropriate words that somehow fail to actually land as genuine, "that's terrible," or "I'm sorry to hear that," delivered with a flatness that doesn't match the content of what's being said. Let's talk about why this specific window, the 5 seconds immediately following disclosure, matters so much more than anything that happens afterward. Remember something we've touched on throughout this entire series regarding the difference between performed and genuine reactions. Performance requires processing time, even if that processing happens quickly and mostly unconsciously. A truly empathetic response doesn't require calculation because it emerges directly from an actual felt reaction to what's being shared. A performed response, even when it's performed skillfully enough to sound almost identical to the real thing, requires a brief moment of internal assessment first. What response is expected here? What response will make me look caring? What response serves my own interests in this conversation? This assessment happens quickly, sometimes in a fraction of a second, but it happens, and its presence, even when nearly undetectable, tends to produce a response that arrives just slightly delayed, just slightly too smooth, just slightly disconnected from genuine, spontaneous feeling. This is worth understanding as considerably more reliable than watching for outright unkindness, because outright unkindness is easy to recognize and easy for someone with genuine social skill to avoid displaying, especially early in a relationship when they're motivated to make a good impression. This 5-second test bypasses that motivation entirely because it targets something people have considerably less conscious control over: their immediate, unguarded reaction, captured before performance has time to fully take over. Let's talk about a specific, common scenario that illustrates this clearly, because it plays out with remarkable consistency across countless different relationships and contexts. You mention, in the middle of an otherwise ordinary conversation, that you've had a genuinely rough week, something specific but not dramatic, a difficult conversation with a family member, a disappointing outcome at work, a minor health worry that's been weighing on you. Watch closely in the immediate aftermath of sharing this for exactly what we've described: the facial expression before words arrive, the content of the very first sentence spoken, and the emotional texture of that first response, whether it feels genuinely present or subtly hollow, subtly rehearsed, subtly more interested in managing the conversation than in actually absorbing what you've shared. What we haven't yet explored is what this 5-second window actually reveals about someone's deeper capacity for empathy over time, why this specific test tends to remain reliable, even with people who are otherwise remarkably skilled at appearing warm and caring in every other context, and how to apply this observation practically without becoming someone who approaches every conversation like a suspicious evaluation rather than a genuine human exchange, which is exactly where we need to go next. Let's talk about why this specific 5-second window remains reliable even with people who are otherwise remarkably skilled at appearing warm and caring in every other context, because this is genuinely important to understand, and it explains why this test works considerably better than more general impressions of someone's overall personality or reputation. Here's the key insight worth understanding precisely. General warmth and charm are almost always at least partially performed, even by people with genuinely good character, because social interaction inherently involves some degree of self-presentation. This isn't unique to narcissistic psychology. Everyone adjusts their tone, their energy, their conversational choices based on context and audience, and this ordinary social calibration doesn't indicate anything concerning on its own. What differs specifically in the 5-second window we're describing is the removal of preparation time. Someone can be genuinely charming across an entire evening, an entire relationship, an entire friendship, while still consistently, reliably failing this specific test, because charm across an extended interaction allows for exactly the kind of ongoing calculation and adjustment that a 5-second, unguarded reaction simply doesn't leave room for. This is worth understanding as the reason so many people are genuinely shocked later to discover concerning patterns in someone who seemed so consistently warm and likable throughout the earlier stages of knowing them. The warmth wasn't necessarily fake in some obvious, easily detectable way. It was simply performed skillfully enough over long enough stretches of interaction that the performance never had to be caught in the specific narrow window where it's actually hardest to sustain. Learning to watch specifically for this 5-second window, rather than relying on general impressions built across hours or months of interaction, gives you access to information that broader impressions genuinely cannot provide, precisely because broader impressions are exactly the terrain where skilled performance operates most effectively and most convincingly. Let's talk about a related pattern worth watching for, one that extends this 5-second test into something slightly more complex, but equally revealing. What happens when you share something difficult a second time, particularly if the first sharing didn't produce the kind of visible engagement or follow-up you might have hoped for? Genuine empathy tends to remember, unprompted, returning to check on how something turned out, asking follow-up questions days or weeks later without needing to be reminded that the concern existed at all. This ongoing tracking of your experience, extending beyond the original 5-second window into actual, sustained memory and continued interest, is worth understanding as a kind of confirmation, a second layer of evidence that supports whatever the initial 5-second reaction suggested. If someone's 5-second reaction seemed genuine, but this ongoing tracking never actually materializes, if difficult things you've shared seem to simply disappear from their awareness the moment the conversation moves elsewhere, this discrepancy is worth taking seriously as additional corroborating information. Now let's talk about something important, because it deserves real attention before we move into how to actually apply this practically. What this test does not reliably indicate, and why it's crucial not to overextend its usefulness beyond what it can actually honestly tell you. A single instance of a less than ideal 5-second reaction doesn't reliably indicate anything significant on its own. People have bad days, distracted moments, genuine difficulty processing news, while their own mind is occupied with something else entirely. Context matters enormously, and it would be a genuine mistake to treat one imperfect reaction as conclusive evidence of anything, especially early in getting to know someone when you don't yet have enough context to interpret a single moment accurately. What actually matters, and this is worth naming with real precision, is pattern across multiple instances, observed over enough time and enough different disclosures that context, mood, and circumstance can be reasonably ruled out as the explanation. If someone consistently, reliably fails this test across many different moments of vulnerability, across different topics, different circumstances, different points in your relationship, this pattern is worth taking seriously as genuine information about their underlying capacity for empathy. A single instance, however disappointing it felt in the moment, is not that same kind of reliable evidence, and treating it as though it were would lead you toward exactly the kind of suspicious, evaluative approach to relationships that ultimately serves no one well, including yourself. Let's talk about how to actually apply this practically, because this matters enormously for making sure this genuinely useful tool doesn't distort how you experience relationships more broadly. The goal was never to approach every conversation as a covert evaluation, silently testing everyone you meet while performing normal social interaction on the surface. This kind of constant, hidden suspicion would cost you something valuable: the genuine presence and openness that actually allows real connection to develop in the first place. Instead, this 5-second observation works best as background awareness, something you notice naturally over time without deliberately engineering test situations or approaching every disclosure as a calculated experiment. Here's what this looks like in practice. Simply paying honest attention to your own genuine reactions after sharing something vulnerable, rather than immediately rationalizing away discomfort or disappointment when a response feels somehow off. Many people, especially people with the kind of deep empathy we've discussed throughout this entire series, have a strong tendency to immediately explain away exactly this kind of discomfort, assuming they must be misreading the situation, assuming the other person was simply distracted, assuming their own expectations were unreasonably high. This 5-second test isn't really about developing a new, more suspicious way of watching other people. It's about learning to trust your own honest, immediate reaction to how someone responds to your vulnerability, rather than automatically overriding that reaction with generous explanations the moment it produces any discomfort at all. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address what this test actually reveals about the deeper capacity we're genuinely trying to assess, why this specific narrow window of observation connects to something considerably larger about how someone will likely treat you over the full course of a relationship, and how to hold this information wisely without either dismissing it prematurely or overreacting to a single instance that might not actually represent anything significant at all. Let's talk about what this 5-second window actually reveals about the deeper capacity we're genuinely trying to assess, because this is worth understanding precisely before we close, since it explains why something so brief connects to something considerably larger about how someone treats the people close to them over the full course of a relationship. Here's the underlying principle worth naming directly. The capacity for genuine, unguarded empathy in a small, low-stakes moment reflects the same underlying capacity that gets tested far more significantly later, during genuinely difficult moments, real crises, real conflicts, real circumstances where someone else's needs, genuinely compete with their own comfort or convenience. Someone whose first immediate reaction to a minor disclosed frustration is genuine and present is drawing on the same internal capacity they'll need to draw on during considerably higher stakes moments, a genuine job loss, a health scare, a significant personal crisis, moments where the ability to set aside their own immediate reaction and genuinely absorb someone else's experience actually matters enormously. Someone who consistently fails this small, low-stakes test isn't likely to suddenly develop that capacity when the stakes become considerably higher and considerably more demanding. If anything, higher stakes tend to make performed empathy considerably harder to sustain, not easier, because genuine crisis requires sustained attention and genuine sacrifice, exactly the resources that performance alone struggles to provide over any meaningful length of time. This is worth understanding, as the actual reason this small, seemingly minor test carries the weight this exploration's title suggests. It isn't that 5 seconds alone constitutes proof of anything clinical or diagnostic. It's that this 5-second window offers a genuinely useful, low-cost preview of a capacity that would otherwise take considerably longer and considerably more personal cost to discover through direct experience during an actual crisis. Learning to notice this pattern early, through many small, low-stakes moments accumulated over time, protects you from the far more expensive lesson of discovering the same underlying pattern only after you've already invested significant trust, time, and vulnerability into someone who was never actually equipped to meet you there when it eventually mattered most. Let's talk about how to hold this information wisely, because this matters enormously for making sure everything we've traced throughout this exploration actually serves you well, rather than becoming another source of anxiety or hypervigilance in your relationships. The wisdom here lies in treating this observation as genuinely useful data, weighted appropriately against everything else you learn about someone over time, rather than as either something to dismiss entirely or something that determines your entire assessment of a person based on a single, isolated moment. Pattern matters far more than any single instance. Context matters enormously. And your own honest, uninflated reaction to how someone responds, trusted rather than immediately explained away, remains one of the most valuable pieces of information available to you throughout the entire process of getting to know someone. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. One that connects this specific, narrow test to something considerably larger this entire series has explored from many different angles. The reason this 5-second window matters isn't really about narcissism as a clinical category at all, even though that's the framing this title uses to draw attention to something genuinely worth watching for. It's about learning to trust small, honest signals rather than waiting for large, undeniable ones that only arrive after considerable cost has already been paid. So much of what we've traced throughout this entire series has centered on exactly this theme: the slow erosion and eventual rebuilding of trust in your own perception, the difference between waiting for dramatic, unmistakable evidence and learning to recognize genuine, if quiet, signals considerably earlier before they've had time to compound into something considerably more costly and considerably harder to walk away from. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've explored today, let it be this. You don't need a dramatic incident, a devastating betrayal, or months of accumulated evidence in order to justify trusting your own honest reaction to how someone responds when you're genuinely vulnerable with them. That reaction, felt in real time, in the actual moment it happens, before you've had the chance to rationalize it into something more comfortable, is genuinely valuable information, worth taking seriously rather than automatically overriding. You were never meant to spend years gathering overwhelming proof before you're allowed to trust what your own honest, immediate perception was already quietly telling you, sometimes in as little as 5 seconds, long before anything more obvious ever had the chance to unfold.